My nephew asked me if he was permitted to take a second helping of macaroni and cheese. He was 10 years old, and the way his eyes searched my face when he asked, like he was already preparing himself for something painful to land on him. That was the second everything inside me went still. I'm Hollis Ramsey, 64 years old, retired now, living by myself in a quiet pocket of Phoenix, Arizona. I worked 29 years as a private investigator before my knees and my spine joined forces and told me the work was over. My wife Margaret passed 5 summers ago, and the silence she left behind never really filled back in. My daughter Tessa lives out in Portland, runs her own veterinary clinic, calls me every Sunday like clockwork. I keep my routine small: coffee on the back patio at sunrise, the morning paper, a walk before the desert heat turns murderous. That suits me fine. What did not suit me, what shook me down to the bone, was what I uncovered about my own brother. Let me pause here for a second, because I want you to understand something. When you've spent nearly 3 decades reading people for a living, you don't lose that skill when you hand in your license. You see things ordinary folks miss: a flinch, a pause that lasts a half second too long, the way a child looks at a plate of food like it might be taken away. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. My brother Garrett Ramsey is 60 years old. He's the older one. Always carried himself like he had life mapped out in straight lines. His first wife, Eleanor, lost her battle with ovarian cancer almost 4 years back. After she was gone, something in Garrett shifted, hardened. I noticed it at the funeral and tried to give him space, the way you do when grief reshapes a person. I had no idea how far that shift had traveled until his son Jasper showed up on my doorstep. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. No greeting, no warmth in his voice. Just Garrett saying he needed me to take Jasper for 12 days, some kind of conference in Portland. When I asked when, he told me he was already on the highway, would be at my place inside the hour, and then the line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. No mention of allergies, no school information, no word about Camille, the woman he'd married barely 7 months after Eleanor's funeral. Just a child arriving and a click. If you've ever had a relative pull something like this on you, you know that particular feeling, that cold finger of suspicion that runs up the back of your neck. I think, if I'm being honest with you, part of me already sensed something was wrong, even before Jasper stepped through that door. The boy showed up clutching a backpack that looked far too heavy for his frame. And his frame, that was what stopped my breath in my chest. He was thin in a way that didn't belong on a healthy 10-year-old. Not gangly thin, not growth spurt thin. Something else, something hollowed out. Garrett's truck was a set of my driveway before I could even greet the boy properly. I crouched down to be closer to Jasper's eye level and asked if he was hungry. He nodded, but he didn't speak, just nodded. I made him a simple lunch: macaroni and cheese, some sliced apples on the side. I gave him a generous portion and sat across from him at my kitchen table. He ate steadily, methodically, like he was paying close attention to every single forkful. When his plate was empty, his eyes drifted to the pot still sitting on the stove, then back to me, then down at his small hands folded in his lap. He whispered something so quiet I almost missed it. "Uncle Hollis, am I allowed to have more?" And then he added, even quieter, like he was reciting from memory, "Dad says wanting more than one plate is being greedy." I want to stop right here for a moment, because I need you to feel what I felt in that instant. A 10-year-old boy asking permission to eat a second helping of pasta, reciting a rule like it was scripture. If you're a parent, an aunt, an uncle, anyone who has ever loved a child, you know that question should never come out of a kid's mouth. Not like that, not with that fear behind the words. I kept my face perfectly neutral. 29 years of sitting across from frightened witnesses, lying spouses, scared children. You learn to keep your face like still water. I told him of course he could have more, that this was my home and he was always welcome to as much as he wanted. He hesitated. Then he reached across the table for the serving spoon, his sleeve pulled back as he stretched, and there on his left forearm, I saw it. Bruising, yellow-green, fading but still readable, and the shape was wrong for a tumble or a knock against furniture. It was hand-shaped, finger-shaped, a grip mark. I felt something cold settle into the pit of my stomach. I told him to take whatever he needed. He ended up eating 2 more full servings. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he looked almost startled at himself, like he hadn't expected to be permitted to do that, like the world had briefly stopped making sense in a good way. I cleaned up the kitchen slowly, kept the conversation deliberately light, asked about his 4th grade teacher, what subjects he liked, Whether he had a best friend at school. He answered in short, careful sentences, not rude, just measured, like a kid who'd been trained that talking too much created problems. I'm telling you, if you'd been sitting in my kitchen that afternoon, you would have known something was deeply wrong too. You don't need a badge to read that kind of fear on a child. That night, after I tucked him into the spare bedroom and he asked 3 separate times if it was okay if he kept the door open, I went into my old office. I still keep the equipment from my working years. A filing cabinet stuffed with closed cases, a 3.5mm camera with a long lens, a small handheld voice recorder I used on surveillance jobs, and a habit I never broke of writing things down the same exact way every time. Date, time, what I observed, what was said, word for word. I opened a fresh notebook and I documented every single thing. His question about seconds, the exact phrasing about greed, the bruising on his left forearm, location, color, approximate age, the unmistakable shape of fingers, his weight, which I estimated at maybe 56 pounds for a 10-year-old. His behavior at the table. 29 years of work has shown me a lot of things. Cheating spouses, insurance fraud, missing teenagers, embezzlers, runaway fathers. Some cases hit you sideways and you have to dig. Others hit you straight on. You know immediately what you're looking at. This was the second kind. I barely slept that first night. I lay in bed listening to the air conditioner cycling, the Phoenix night quiet outside, and I thought about how easy it would have been to send him back without asking questions, how most people probably would have. And here's where I want to drop a little personal truth on you. If I were in your position right now, watching this story unfold, I think I'd want to ask myself a hard question. Would I have noticed? Would I have looked past the surface? Or would I have made myself believe everything was fine because confronting the truth would mean confronting my own brother? The next morning, I scrambled some eggs and made cinnamon toast. He ate every crumb, then sat very still with his hands folded in his lap, waiting. Not asking, just waiting to see what came next. I told him there was more if he wanted it. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was measuring whether I really meant it. Then his small hand reached for another slice of toast. Slow and almost apologetic. I spent that entire day building the foundation of what I knew was going to become a case. While we were unloading groceries from my truck, I made sure to angle the camera so I could photograph his arms with the timestamp visible in the corner of the frame. I noted everything in the notebook. I kept my voice easy, my questions soft and casual. I never pushed. When you push a frightened child, they shut down like a steel door, and I knew that bone deep. By the end of the second day, he was beginning to thaw a little. He started speaking in slightly longer sentences. He laughed once at a commercial on television, a quick startled sound, and then immediately checked my face to make sure laughing was permitted. I wrote that down too. On the third day, I called Marcus Delaney. Marcus and I go back to my earliest years working cases. He was a homicide detective with the Phoenix PD, when I was the outside consultant they brought in when they needed someone without the constraints of a badge. We'd kept in touch through retirements, divorces, grandchildren, and quiet beers on his back porch. He knew exactly how I worked. I told him I needed a discreet look at my brother's finances. Specifically, anything connected to the life insurance policy that paid out when Eleanor died nearly 4 years ago. I asked whether any of that money had been placed into a trust for the boy. Marcus asked me how far I needed him to dig. I told him far enough to tell me where the money landed, every dollar of it, and whether 1 cent of it had been set aside in Jasper's name. He told me everything would be by the book. He asked for 48 hours. That same afternoon, I called Vivian Aldridge. She runs a division over at Arizona Child Protective Services, sharp as a tack, been navigating that system longer than I'd been chasing cases. I explained calmly what I had. She listened without a single interruption, which told me she was taking it seriously. She told me to keep building the record, document everything. When I was ready to file, call her direct line and they would move quickly. Then she said something that hit me hard. Hollis, don't wait too long. I told her I wouldn't. Now let me pause and speak directly to anyone watching this. If you've ever been in a position where you suspect a child is being harmed, please understand that documentation matters more than you can imagine. Photos with timestamps, specific dates, exact words. You think it doesn't make a difference? It makes all the difference in the world when a judge is reading a case file. Don't ever assume someone else will catch what you've caught. If you saw it, you're the witness. You're the person who has to act. I think if I'm being honest, that's the lesson I learned the hardest way during all my years of work. Most child abuse cases that fail in court fail not because the abuse wasn't real, but because nobody bothered to write down what they saw. By the fourth day, Jasper had started talking on his own without me prompting him. We were in the kitchen putting together turkey sandwiches for lunch. He was carefully slicing a tomato, slow and deliberate, concentrating like the task mattered enormously. I was at the counter pretending to read the sports section of the paper. He told me his dad had a chart on the refrigerator. I asked him what kind of chart. He kept his eyes locked on the tomato. He explained there was a chart with all the household rules listed on it. If you broke one, there was a checkbox. Too many checkboxes and you lost a meal. He said his dad called it accountability training. I set the paper down very carefully. I asked him how often the boxes got checked. He thought about it for a long beat. Maybe 3 or 4 times a week, he said. I asked what happened when the boxes got checked. He explained it like he was reciting the rules of a board game. 1 box meant no dessert. 2 boxes meant no dinner. 3 boxes meant no breakfast the next morning either. Flat. Matter of fact. Like this was just how households operated everywhere. I felt my hands tighten on the counter. I want you to think about that for a second. A 10-year-old child describing systematic food withholding the way you or I might describe taking out the trash on Tuesdays. If you were sitting in my place at that exact moment, I think your heart would have cracked the way mine did. I wrote it all down that night. The exact words, the exact sequence. I learned early in my career that the most critical thing you can possibly do is get the words right. Not close. Exactly right. Courts care about exactly right. A paraphrase will not save a child. A direct quote will. On day 5, I made the call to Camille, Garrett's new wife. They'd met about 13 months after Eleanor's funeral. Married fast, the way some people do when they're trying to outrun grief or loneliness or both. I'd only met her twice. She seemed like a reasonable person, a dental hygienist who'd been widowed herself a few years prior. I called her in the mid-afternoon. Kept it casual. I told her Jasper was doing well. Thought she might appreciate hearing that. I mentioned I was planning to cook a proper dinner that night and wondered if she'd like to come over. Nothing fancy. I said it might be nice for the boy to see a familiar face. She accepted without a moment's hesitation. She arrived at 6:30. I'd made a brisket with roasted vegetables, set the table properly with cloth napkins. Jasper seemed neutral about seeing her. Not warm, not cold. He ate quietly, then asked permission to watch television in the den. I told him absolutely. Once he was out of earshot, Camille and I talked. I kept the conversation easy for the first 20 minutes. Asked how she was settling in, how the adjustment had been, whether she liked Phoenix. She seemed relaxed, sipping her wine. That was important. Then I let the conversation drift slowly toward the boy. I mentioned that Jasper seemed like he was carrying something heavy. I asked her if she'd noticed. She went quiet for a long moment. She said Garrett was very particular about how Jasper was being raised. I asked her what she meant by particular. She turned her wine glass slowly between her fingers. She said he had a system, rules and consequences. He believed children needed structure to build character. I said sure, of course. Then I mentioned that Jasper had brought up something about meals being taken away as punishment. I said that seemed extreme for a 10-year-old. There was a longer pause this time. She told me there had been one night, about 2 months ago. Garrett had said Jasper failed a math quiz and lied about the grade, so there was no dinner that evening. Camille had checked on the boy around 10 at night, found him sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, just sitting there. She asked him if he was all right. She stopped speaking for a moment, looking down at her wine. I asked her what he said. She told me he'd said he was fine, but he didn't look fine. She added that she'd mentioned the situation to Garrett afterward, and Garrett had told her she was undermining the system, that if she kept stepping in, the boy would never learn. She said she'd let it go. She said she shouldn't have. Now, my voice recorder was sitting on the kitchen counter. Small, black, the kind of thing that looks like a phone charger if you're not specifically looking for it. Arizona is a one-party consent state when it comes to recordings. I was the party giving consent. I steered the conversation gently toward easier topics for the rest of the meal. When she left around 9, she actually seemed lighter, like saying it out loud, had taken something off her chest. I sat at my kitchen table after she drove away and played the recording back. Crystal clear audio, her voice steady and direct. Specific details, specific dates, specific locations. It was exactly the piece I needed. Let me just say this directly. If I were in your shoes watching this story right now, I'd want to remember something important. People who witness these things often carry guilt for years, for staying silent, for not stepping in. If you've ever been that person, the one who saw something and didn't act, Please understand that it's never too late to speak. Camille was that person, and her speaking up changed everything. I called Diane Whitlock that night. She's a family law attorney I'd done investigative work for twice during my PI years. Tough, precise, never wasted a syllable. I told her I had documentation building on a child neglect case. Food deprivation as structured punishment, physical evidence of restraint bruising, a recorded admission from a household witness. I needed to know how fast she could move if this went to court. She asked when I needed her ready. I told her possibly within days. She said to send everything I had by the next morning, and she'd clear her schedule. I hung up and went to check on Jasper. He was asleep with the television still on at low volume. He'd pulled the comforter all the way up to his chin and had one hand curled under his cheek. He looked, for the first time since he'd arrived at my door, like a regular 10-year-old kid. I switched off the television and stood in that doorway for a long minute. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from Garrett. He said his return flight had been moved up. He'd be landing Friday night. Friday. That was 36 hours away. I'd been counting on having 5 more full days. I stood in that dark hallway running the math through my head. Marcus still had the financial records coming. I had the recording, the notebook, the photographs. Enough to file, but I'd wanted more time to clean it all up. 36 hours would have to be enough. I went back into my office and I started organizing every piece of evidence into a sequence that would make sense to a judge. Chronological, clear, nothing out of order. That's how you win these things. Not with volume, with order. I called Vivian Aldridge at 7 the next morning. I told her Garrett was returning Friday night, that I needed to file today. She asked how complete my documentation was. I told her complete enough, that I was still waiting on financial records, but the core case was solid. She said to send her everything I had by noon, and she would open the case that afternoon. I thanked her. She told me not to thank her yet, just to get her the files. I spent the morning making backup copies of everything. Photographs printed and dated, notebook pages photographed and stored on 2 separate drives, the audio recording transferred to 2 different devices. By 11:30 I had a folder sitting on my kitchen table that was nearly 2 inches thick. Marcus Delaney called me at 11:47. He said he had the financial picture and that I'd want to sit down. Eleanor's life insurance policy had paid out $230,000 when she passed. The policy had specific language directing a substantial portion toward Jasper's education and care. Marcus had traced every single dollar from the payout date forward. Not 1 cent had gone into a trust for the boy. No college fund. No savings account in Jasper's name. What Marcus found instead was a brand new Ford F-250 truck, registered solely to Garrett, purchased 5 months after the payout cleared. A complete kitchen renovation on the house, financed partly from the same account, and a joint checking account opened in Garrett and Camille's names, seeded with $65,000 7 months after Eleanor's death. Marcus said it plainly. All of it was the boy's money. Every cent. I sat with that for a long minute. Jasper eating 3 plates of pasta because he didn't know when he'd be permitted a full meal again, and his mother's life insurance sitting in his father's joint account with a woman the boy barely knew. I asked Marcus to put it all in writing. He said it was already typed up and on its way to my email. If you're watching this and feeling that hot, sick anger I felt in that moment, I get it. I really do. There's something particularly vile about a parent stealing from their own child, especially money that was meant to honor a mother who died. I think if I'm being honest, that was the moment when I stopped feeling any shred of brotherly hesitation. He'd crossed a line I didn't know existed. I printed Marcus's report the moment it came through and added it to the folder. Then I called Diane. I told her the life insurance payout meant for Jasper had gone into Garrett's personal accounts. None of it had been set aside for the boy. She was quiet for a beat. She said this changed the shape of the case significantly. We weren't just looking at neglect anymore. We were looking at misappropriation of funds designated for a minor. I asked her how that helped us. She said it gave the judge a second track. Even if Garrett's attorney found a way to soften the neglect narrative, the financial piece would be far harder to explain away. It was documented, it was traceable, and it cast Jasper's welfare in a very specific and damning light. I emailed her the entire folder. She called me back 20 minutes later. She said this was a solid case, to be ready for a hearing date sometime in late August. Garrett's truck pulled into his driveway across the street at 8:20 Friday night. I know the exact time because I was watching from my front window. He didn't come to my door that evening. I figured he'd wait until morning to collect his son, which gave me one more night with the boy. He showed up at 9 sharp Saturday morning. I opened the door before he had a chance to knock. I greeted him. He looked past me into the house. He asked where Jasper was. I told him the boy was still sleeping and invited him inside. Garrett stepped in but stayed close to the door, the way you do when you don't intend to stay. He said he'd just collect his son and get out of my way. I told him I wanted to talk first. Something shifted in his face, a tightening around his mouth I'd seen before, back when we were kids and he was about to lie to our father. I told him Jasper had been thin, really thin, that the boy had asked me, on his very first day, whether he was permitted to have a second helping of food. I reminded him that Jasper was 10 years old. His jaw locked. He told me he ran a structured household, that children needed limits. I told him there was a wide canyon between limits and not feeding your son. He told me Jasper ate fine. I told him the boy was barely 56 pounds. He told me Jasper was built like Eleanor, that she'd been a small woman. I looked at him for a long moment. He held my eyes, which told me he'd practiced this conversation. He had his answers locked and loaded. I told him to take care of his son. That was all I was asking. He called for Jasper, who came down the stairs with his backpack already strapped on his shoulders. The boy looked at me one time before walking out the door. I held up one hand. He gave me the smallest nod back, and then he was gone. I filed the report with Vivian that same afternoon. The next 10 days unfolded on 2 parallel tracks. On the surface, nothing looked any different. Garrett's house sat quiet across the street. Jasper went to school. Life on our block went on like it had for years. But underneath, things were moving fast. Vivian opened a formal investigation and scheduled an unannounced home visit. Diane filed the custody petition with Maricopa County Family Court. The hearing was set for August 22nd before Judge Olivia Brennan. Garrett was served the legal papers on a Tuesday afternoon. He called me that same evening, his voice low and venomous. He said I'd done this. Not a question, a statement. I told him I'd reported what I saw. He told me Jasper was his son, that I'd had no right to go around him. I told him I had every right, that his son had come to my house and couldn't ask for a second plate of food without flinching. He told me he was going to fight this, that when he was finished, I would never see the boy again. I told him to get a lawyer, that he was going to need one. He hired a man named Brent Castillo, known throughout Phoenix family court as aggressive and expensive. I'd heard the name during my working years. He was good. That was fine. Diane was better. While the legal side ran its course, I spent 2 solid weeks talking to people on the block. Mrs. Imelda Ortiz had lived diagonally across from Garrett's place for 15 years. She was 73, sharp as a fresh knife, and she'd seen things. She told me that little boy sat outside by himself more than any child should. Even on January nights when the desert temperatures dropped near freezing, she'd seen him out there in a thin windbreaker, just sitting on the porch steps. She said one evening around 10 o'clock, she'd watched him try the front door handle twice, found it locked both times. He sat back down and just waited. I asked her if she would testify to that. She told me she'd been waiting for someone to ask her. I drove out to Jasper's elementary school and met with his 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Rosalind Pierce. She pulled his file before I'd even fully sat down. She said he'd lost weight noticeably since the start of the school year, and he kept food in his jacket pocket. Crackers, apple slices. He wouldn't throw anything away, not even cores. She folded her hands on the desk. She told me that if she reached across to hand him a paper too quickly, he flinched back, not like a startled kid, like a child who expected to be grabbed. I asked her if she would put that in writing and testify if needed. She said yes without a moment's hesitation. I added both statements to the folder. It was nearly 4 inches thick by then. Tessa called me from Portland that night. I told her everything. She listened the way she does when something serious is unfolding, mostly silent, taking it all in. She asked if I was holding up all right. I told her I was fine, just wanted this thing to land properly in court. She said it would, that I knew how to build a case. I told her that knowing how and watching it happen to your own family were 2 very different things. She didn't argue. She just told me she loved me and that she'd fly down for the hearing if I needed her. I told her to stay with her practice, that I had Tessa here in spirit, and that was enough. I sat at my kitchen table after the call with the folder spread in front of me. Photographs, notebook, audio recording, Marcus's financial report, 2 witness statements, school documentation, the CPS case number, everything in order. 3 weeks until the hearing. I closed the folder and went to bed. Now let me speak directly to you again for a moment. If you've ever been the relative who watched something terrible unfold inside your own family and felt powerless, please hear me when I tell you that your eyes are evidence. Your memory is evidence. The conversations you witness, the behaviors you notice, the small details that don't add up. All of that has weight in a courtroom. I think the biggest mistake people make is assuming someone with more authority will eventually catch what they've caught. They won't. You have to be the one who acts. If you find yourself in a situation like this, and start a notebook today, write down dates, take photographs when it's safe to do so, reach out to your local CPS office. You don't need a license or a badge or a law degree. You just need the courage to document the truth and the patience to wait until your case is solid enough to file. August 22nd arrived hot and heavy, the way late summer mornings do in Phoenix. I wore my charcoal suit, the one I'd bought for Margaret's funeral, and hadn't put on since. It still fit, somehow. I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about that. Tessa had flown in from Portland 3 days earlier, despite my telling her she didn't need to. She sat in the row directly behind me in the courtroom, close enough that I could hear her breathing. Diane sat to my left with the folder open in front of her, color-coded tabs marking every section. Across the aisle, Garrett sat with Brent Castillo. Camille was seated one row behind Garrett, hands folded in her lap, eyes locked straight ahead. Judge Olivia Brennan walked in at 9 sharp. She was in her early 60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. The kind of judge who'd witnessed every imaginable variation of every family court drama she wasn't going to be performed at. That was good. I didn't need theater. I needed someone who'd look hard at the facts. Castillo went first. He framed it exactly the way I'd predicted. Hollis Ramsey, bitter, grieving widower, a man who'd lost his wife and was using his nephew as a way to insert himself into a family that had moved on without him. He brought up 2 complaints from my PI years, both dismissed, both still on the public record. He said I had a history of overreach, of letting personal investment cloud professional judgment. He painted Garrett as a grieving widower doing his level best to raise a son alone, with a structured approach to discipline that was firm but not harmful. He said the CPS visit had found nothing rising to the level of abuse. He said this petition had been filed out of bitter spite. He was good. I'll give him that. Then Diane stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't use dramatic pauses or theatrical gestures. She walked the judge through the evidence in chronological sequence, the way you'd explain something complicated to someone you genuinely respected. She started with the notebook. Read out 6 specific entries, dates and times, and Jasper's exact words. The chart on the refrigerator with the checkboxes, the number of times per week meals were systematically withheld, the comment about greed and second helpings. She placed the photographs on the evidence table one at a time, each one labeled and dated, the bruising on Jasper's left forearm documented across 4 consecutive days. Then she called Mrs. Imelda Ortiz to the stand. Imelda walked slowly to the witness chair, settled herself, and pulled out the handwritten notes she'd made after I'd visited her. The judge watched her with the kind of attention you give someone who isn't performing. Imelda described that January evening, the temperature, the time, Jasper in his thin windbreaker on the porch steps. She described watching him try the door handle twice and sit back down. She said she'd almost crossed the street and that she'd regretted not crossing it every single day since. Castillo cross-examined her, asked how she could possibly be certain of the date, the temperature, the time. Imelda told him she'd checked the National Weather Service records online after my visit. She produced a printed page showing Phoenix temperatures for that specific night, 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 10:15 at night. Castillo sat down. Mrs. Rosalind Pierce came next. She was calm in the way teachers get when they've decided something matters. She described Jasper's weight loss between September and spring, the food in his jacket pocket, the way he flinched when an adult moved near him too quickly. She said she'd flagged her concerns to the school counselor twice and been told to monitor the situation. Then Diane played the audio recording of Camille. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Camille's voice came through with perfect clarity. The night she'd found Jasper sitting alone in the dark, the conversation she'd had with Garrett afterward, and what he'd said to her. The fact that she'd let it go. When the recording ended, Castillo was already on his feet with an objection. Judge Brennan looked at Diane. Diane stated calmly that Arizona was a one-party consent state, that the recording took place at Mr. Ramsey's residence, and that he was a participant in the conversation. Brennan overruled the objection. The recording stayed in evidence. Then something happened that I had not anticipated. Camille stood up. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there. Her own attorney, who'd been sitting beside her as a precaution, put a hand on her arm. She shook her head slowly. She asked through the court clerk to be permitted to address the court as a witness. Castillo objected loudly. Judge Brennan allowed it. Camille took the stand, and she didn't look at Garrett a single time. She looked directly at the judge and she talked. She described the padlock on the pantry that had been installed before she moved in, which Garrett had told her was to keep Jasper from snacking between meals. She described the chest freezer in the garage that required a code she wasn't given for the first 3 months of their marriage. She described an evening 6 weeks after the wedding when she'd seen Garrett grab Jasper hard by the upper arm and walk him to his bedroom because the boy had left his sneakers by the front door instead of in the hall closet. She said Jasper had not cried. She said that was the part that scared her the most. She said the boy hadn't cried because he'd already learned that crying wasn't worth the additional consequence. She said she hadn't spoken up sooner because she'd told herself it wasn't that bad, that Garrett loved his son, that she didn't want to damage a marriage she'd just begun. She said she understood now that staying silent had been a choice, and that the choice had cost Jasper. The courtroom was very, very still. Garrett's face had gone the color of old paper. He leaned toward Castillo and said something I couldn't hear. Castillo placed a flat hand on the table in the universal gesture of stop talking right now. I want to stop here for a second, because what Camille did took enormous courage. If you've ever been in a position where staying quiet felt safer than speaking the truth, I want you to remember her. She walked into that courtroom planning to support her husband and walked out a witness for a child. That is not a small thing. That is one of the bravest things a person can do. Then it was Garrett's turn on the stand. Diane walked him through the financial records, the insurance payout, the truck, the kitchen renovation, the joint account. She asked him to explain what portion of Eleanor's life insurance had been set aside for Jasper's education or care. He said he'd planned to open a fund when things stabilized. She asked how long ago Eleanor had passed. He said almost 4 years. She asked what had prevented him from opening that account in nearly 4 years. He said it had been a difficult time. She placed Marcus's full financial report on the evidence table and asked the judge to enter it. Judge Brennan did. Then Diane asked him about the chart on the refrigerator. Garrett said it was a discipline system. She asked whether withholding food from a 56-pound 10-year-old was part of that system. He said food was a privilege that had to be earned through demonstrated responsibility. She asked him where he had originally learned that idea. He stopped. He looked down at his hands. He didn't say anything for a long, heavy moment. Then he said his father had raised him the same way. Diane asked him quietly how that had worked out for him. Castillo objected on grounds of relevance. Brennan sustained it, but it didn't matter. The answer was already hanging in the air of that courtroom. Garrett's composure had been steady right up until that question. When Diane sat down, he put both hands over his face and stayed that way. His shoulders moved. He wasn't performing. Whatever was happening had finally gotten past every defense he'd built. Brennan called a recess and stated she would return her ruling in 7 days. I walked out of the courtroom into the marble hallway and sat down hard on a wooden bench. Tessa came and sat beside me. Neither of us said anything for a long while. She finally asked if I was all right. I told her, yeah, just tired. She put her hand on my shoulder and left it there. That was enough. Judge Brennan issued her ruling on August 29th. Tessa was still in town. We sat in the same courtroom, same seats, same charcoal suit on me. Garrett sat across the aisle with Castillo. Camille was not present. Brennan read the ruling without preamble. Parental rights for Garrett Ramsey terminated. The financial misappropriation of funds designated for Jasper's welfare would be referred to a separate civil proceeding. Garrett would be required to restore the full amount into a court-administered trust for Jasper within 18 months. Custody of Jasper Ramsey awarded to Hollis Ramsey, pending the home assessment already completed and cleared by Arizona CPS. Visitation for Garrett, eligible to apply after 6 months of documented therapeutic treatment, supervised only at the court's discretion. She closed the folder and looked at Garrett directly. She told him the patterns documented in this case had not begun with him, but that they ended here. What he chose to do with that knowledge was entirely up to him. Garrett sat with his head bowed. He didn't respond. Castillo gathered the papers quietly. Outside on the courthouse steps, Tessa and I stood in the late August Arizona heat and didn't say much. She had a flight back to Portland in 2 days. I told her I'd call every Sunday like always. She said she knew I would. Jasper moved in that following Saturday. 3 boxes. A 10-year-old boy's entire life packed into 3 cardboard boxes that fit in the bed of my truck with room to spare. I carried them upstairs while he stood in the doorway of the bedroom that was now his. looking at the bed and the window and the empty bookshelves. I told him he could put whatever he wanted on those shelves. He nodded slowly. He asked if he could put up a picture. I told him he could put up anything he wanted, that this was his room now. The first 2 weeks were harder than I'd fully prepared for. He woke up 2 or 3 times some nights, not screaming, just sitting bolt upright in bed with his eyes wide open, not entirely sure where he was. I'd hear him through the wall and go in and sit in the rocking chair by the window until he settled back down. Some nights I just stayed there until morning. My back paid the price. I didn't care. He kept food hidden in his room, crackers tucked under the mattress, an apple wrapped in a paper towel inside the nightstand drawer. I found them when I changed his sheets and I left them exactly where they were. You don't fix that kind of fear by removing the things. You fix it by making sure the fear behind it slowly stops making sense to him. By mid-October, he was sleeping through most nights. He started leaving his bedroom door open when he went to bed, which I took as a quiet good sign. I taught him how to use my old 5mm film camera. We started simple, how to hold it steady, how to look through the viewfinder, and wait for the frame to feel right before pressing the shutter. He was patient with the process in a way that surprised me. One afternoon, he took a picture of our backyard, just the brittle grass and the late afternoon light slanting through the mesquite tree at the back of the lot. When the print developed, he held it carefully with both hands and stared at it for a long time. He asked if he could keep it. I told him it was his. He'd taken it. He pinned it above his desk that evening. It's still hanging there. Garrett called on a Wednesday night, about a month after the ruling. Late, after 10 o'clock, I almost didn't pick up. He said he wasn't supposed to contact me directly. He knew that. He just needed to say something. I waited. He told me he'd convinced himself for a long time that he was doing right by Jasper. That structure was what the boy needed after losing his mother. That Garrett had been harder on him because he didn't want him to be soft in a world that doesn't go easy on soft people. He stopped. He said his court-mandated therapist had asked him last week where he'd learned all of that, and that he'd known the answer before she'd even finished asking the question. I didn't say anything. He told me he wasn't asking me to forgive him. He was asking me to take care of his son the way he hadn't been able to figure out how to. I told him I would. He told me he knew I would. There was a long pause. He told me Jasper had always liked me, even when we hadn't seen much of each other in those years. He said the boy used to ask about me. The line went quiet for a moment. Then he said goodnight and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. The house was quiet. Upstairs, Jasper was asleep. Tessa is flying in for Thanksgiving. It'll be the first time the 3 of us are all in the same house. Jasper asked me last week if Tessa would like him. I told him Tessa was going to think he was the best kid she'd ever met. He nodded and went back to his homework like that was settled. He still flinches sometimes. He still checks the pantry before bed out of pure habit, running his small hand along the shelf like he needs to confirm the food is still there. These things take time. I know that. I'm not in any kind of hurry. Now let me speak directly to you for one final moment. If something in this story felt familiar to you, if it stirred up a memory or a worry about a child you know, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need a badge or a case file or 29 years of professional experience to act when a child is telling you something without using words. Jasper didn't come to me with a speech. He asked for a second helping of macaroni and looked at me like he was waiting to be punished for asking. That was the entire story, right there in that single moment. This teaches us something important. The worst forms of harm rarely announce themselves loudly. They show up in the smallest gestures, a flinch, a hesitation, a child asking permission for something no child should ever have to ask permission for. The mistake most people make is waiting for absolute proof before acting. But by the time you have absolute proof, the damage is often already deep. Here in the United States, you can call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 anytime, day or night, completely confidentially. Every state has its own CPS reporting line. You don't have to be certain. You just have to be concerned enough to make a call. Some of us are at a stage of life where we believe our time to matter has already passed us by. I'm telling you, it has not. The skills you've built over a lifetime, the things you know how to see, the patience you earned the hard way, those skills don't retire when you do. They're still inside you. Use them. Ask yourself this tonight. Is there a child in my life whose silence has been telling me something I've been refusing to hear? If the answer is yes, do something about it tomorrow. Make one phone call. Write down one observation. Take one small step. Because that one step might be the entire difference between a child who gets rescued and a child who doesn't. Jasper is safe now. He's home. He took a photograph of our backyard last week that I genuinely think is good. I told him so, and he smiled like he didn't quite believe me but was glad I'd said it. That's enough. That's more than enough. Now I want to hear from you. Comment 1 if you think Hollis did the right thing the moment he saw that bruise. Comment 2 if you believe Garrett deserved a faster path to forgiveness given his own history. Comment 3 if you've ever found yourself in a similar situation, either as a witness or a survivor. And right below that, tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, your time zone, what time it is right now where you are. I love reading comments from every corner of the world, and it genuinely means everything when you share where you're tuning in from. Disclaimer: this is a fictional story inspired by common real-world cases, but 100% rewritten by me here in Phoenix, Arizona, to avoid reused content and to honor the seriousness of the subject. If this story moved you in any way, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Your support is what allows me to keep telling these stories. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next one.